Hello again, Year 10. I hope you're well, and I hope you managed to enjoy a bit of a break over the bank holiday weekend. In this week's lessons, we're going to look at one of the most significant events, or one of the most significant consequences of the Norman invasion of England. And they are consequences that came directly from the rebellions you learned about last week. But before we jump into that, let's take a look at our retrieval starter quiz to see how much you remember. Now, today's starter quiz does mostly focus on those events of last week to make sure we can pick up those strands in this week's lesson. If you're doing it on a computer, then you should have the document open in front of you and maybe have this video playing on something else. You can type it straight into there if you have access to that. If you don't have access to a computer, then feel free to do all of this work on paper. At the end of the lesson, take a picture of it and you can submit that to Google Classroom as well. If you don't know how to do that, just drop me an email and I can send you a short video with some instructions about how to submit from a phone or from a picture. So let's start with the retrieval starter quiz, either on your paper or in the document. Please pause this video now and have a go at those 9 questions. Pause the video now. Fantastic. So let's self-check and correct. If you're doing it on a computer, make sure you change your font colour to green so your teacher can see the ones you got right and the ones you got wrong. All of the Year 10 teachers are checking in on your work every single week at the moment, so it'll be great to see who's done really, really well at this, who can stick more positives on class charts. So, in green or a different colour pen, let's self-check and correct. So number 1 is a description of William Fitz-Osborne, one of William's most trusted advisors and someone who William gave several different jobs to. 2 is King Sweyn, the Viking leader who sent troops to invade during the Second Rebellion, but also invaded himself in the Third Rebellion at Ely. 3 is Hereward the Wake, the Anglo-Saxon leader of the rebellion at Ely, a man who rebelled against William because William's men had killed his brother while he was exiled. 4 is the 1068 First Anglo-Saxon Revolt. 5 is the 1069 Second Anglo-Saxon Revolt. 6 is the 1069 Anglo-Danish attack on York. Now, the events in question 5 and question 6 are essentially part of the same rebellion. Number 7 is the 1070 to 71 rebellion at Ely. 8 is Stigand and Ealdred. And 9 is a definition of a marcher earldom, something William created to help him control England. Please make sure you've self-checked and corrected all those questions. And let's take a look at the main question for today's lesson. Today we're going to be answering this question. How did William use fear and violence to end rebellions in the north of England after 1068? How did William use fear and violence to end rebellions in the north of England after 1068? Now there is quite a lot from last week's lesson that you can use to answer this question already. You might not have a big in-depth answer, but there are 2 key ideas I'd like you to empty your head about with what you already know. The first one is what you already know about why would William want to use fear and violence in the north after 1068? But then also, what did he do to the north after 1068? They are 2 things that I mentioned in last week's lessons and that were involved in those lessons. If you're doing it in the document, you can do it straight under step 3 with the what do you already know box. Please pause this video and empty your head now with what you already know. Pause the video now. Fantastic. Now that's a really important step because by thinking back a week or 2, by retrieving those memories, you're going to strengthen them for the long term. But also by waking up those memories in your head, because today's information directly connects to it, by waking it up in your head, the new information I'm introducing today will be a bit stickier and your brain will make more connections, and again you'll find it easier to remember this information. So well done for taking part in that most important what do you already know step. Now the structure of today's lesson is really straightforward. And we're going to be looking at an event called the Harrying of the North. And it's going to be two really straightforward steps today. We're going to start by looking at the causes of the harrying of the North, and this will be where we make a lot of connections to last week's lesson. After we've looked at the causes of the harrying of the North, we're then going to focus on the events of the harrying of the North. So starting first with the causes, I'm going to talk you through and lecture you through a few bits of information. Can you take detailed notes about what these images represent? I will put keywords for you on the screen as well to help you out with any difficult spellings or more complicated words. If you are not doing this in the Google Sheets document, that's absolutely fine. It's a really good idea just to draw some simple images as you take your notes, because the simple images will help you remember them. When I was looking through last week, I saw some really good, really detailed and really kind of simple as well though, images that a few people were drawing. I won't name any names, but some simple images that are really going to help those people remember them next time. So if you do it on paper, just simple stick figures and things will be really helpful. So, the causes of the harrying of the North. And there are many, many reasons why William wanted to finally start using all-out violence and oppression in the north of England. The first one was the death and murder of Robert Comyn. Now, Robert Comyn, to remind you, was the Norman who was murdered at the start of the Second Rebellion in Durham. He was a man who had been appointed as the new Earl of Northumbria. And when he arrived in Durham, the Anglo-Saxons didn't want him to be their new Earl. So the Anglo-Saxons started to fight the Normans. You might remember that Robert Comyn went to hide in a building. That building was set on fire. He ran out of the building to escape the fire and he was killed in the streets. And because Robert Comyn was such a loyal follower of William, when he found out he'd been murdered by the Anglo-Saxons, William, as you can imagine, was furious. And he wanted revenge. And that sense that William wanted revenge is a really key cause of the harrying of the North. Another cause of the harrying of the North are the tactics that were being used by the Anglo-Saxon rebels. Now, the Anglo-Saxons knew they couldn't defeat William in a normal army-to-army battle. They knew the Normans were too powerful, the Anglo-Saxons were too weak. So the strategies and tactics that were being used by the Anglo-Saxons were what we call guerrilla tactics. We mentioned it last week. It was where the Anglo-Saxons would kind of pop up in a surprise attack the Normans in one area. Then after that attack, they would vanish and run away, and then pop up somewhere else, another attack later. Now, this was really hard for the Normans to stop because they never knew where the next attack would come from, and they were finding it very hard to find the Anglo-Saxon soldiers who were committing those attacks. Remember, the Anglo-Saxons would have had the expertise in the area. And this meant that William decided that the only way he could end the guerrilla attacks was to completely destroy the areas where they were happening. It wasn't that he could just defeat the Anglo-Saxons in battle like he had at Hastings. It had to be a complete destruction of anything that might have supported the guerrilla soldiers. Another cause of the harrying of the North is that William has finally realised and is finally starting to understand that the north of England has a very different culture to the south of England. When William first invades and first becomes the King of England, he doesn't fully understand the makeup of the country he's now in charge of. Well, now after a few years of being there, after seeing several revolts come up against him, he realises that the Danelaw parts of the north of England, where they speak different languages, have different laws, have different traditions, have a very different culture, are not acting in the same ways as the people in the south. So because of that, he now realises he needs to have different tactics in the north and different tactics in the south. He's finding it easier to control the south of England, the north not so much. So because of that, he starts to prepare another strategy, another tactic, which is, like I say, known as a harrying of the north. Another reason why he wants to try the harrying of the North in the north is because of the threat posed by the Vikings. Because of that Danelaw area in the north, if the Vikings are going to attack again, they're going to land in the north of England in the Danelaw. So William thinks if he uses a lot of violence and he completely destroys the north, then if the Danes and the Vikings return, there'll be no one there to support them. So by obliterating the north, by destroying the north, he's going to weaken the Vikings' ability to attack England as well. Finally, the last reason why William wanted to do the harrying of the north is he's starting to give up on the Anglo-Saxon earls. At first, after 1066, William thinks maybe he can work with the earls, maybe he can get their loyalty, he can use their expertise and work together to control England. But people like Edwin and Morcar, Edgar the Atheling, have now revolted several times. And William essentially is giving up on trusting the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. So his decision now is to be much, much more brutal. So, they are the main causes of the harrying of the north, and I just want to hit pause on that new information and give the opportunity to check in and develop your understanding. Now, in the Google document, you've got some boxes to type directly in. If you don't have the Google document, if you're doing it on paper, I've put the questions on screen. Now, I'd like each of those questions to please be answered in full developed sentences, because it's important that you practice your communication in history. And I'd like you to answer in at least 3 sentences each, 3 full sentences each. It's going to get you to reflect, think, and start to analyse the information I've just talked you through. So please pause this video now and answer those 3 questions on screen. Pause the video now. Brilliant. So, your teacher will take a look at those answers to help judge your understanding early next week. Let's start to take a look then. If we've got the causes of the harrying of the north out of the way, let's start to take a look at what were the events of the harrying of the north. When I keep saying this term, harrying of the north, what actually was it? Now, the harrying of the north is what historians refer to as the period where William essentially destroys northern livelihoods. He tries to make the north of England an area where it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for people to live. And the way he goes about it is he sends his men to kill, to destroy all of the agriculture, which is the farming, all of the agriculture, all of the livestock, which are the animals, things like the cows, the sheep, the pigs. He even gets his Norman soldiers to destroy things like the seeds, which would have prevented them from replanting and growing food again in the future. And as I mentioned last week, he even got his men to sow salt into the earth. And by digging that salt into the earth, it meant that crops wouldn't grow there again in the future. So he wasn't just destroying the land at that time, he was making it impossible for people to live there, to farm there in the future. Now, because of this, it's thought that up to 100,000 Anglo-Saxons died, either through the attacks or through the starvation. And it made the northern Anglo-Saxons absolutely desperate. Now, to give you a few examples of how desperate they actually were, there have been reports that some people turned to cannibalism. That in their desperation, they started to eat people. Now, that was rare, obviously. It's something that people only turn to when they're desperate. What was a lot more common was that the northerners became refugees. They decided to leave the north. They realised it was too hard for them to live there. If they'd survived the initial attacks, they simply moved south to where the weather was less harsh, to where there was more food. But the benefit for William there was that if they were living in the south, they would be easier for him to control because they'd be nearer his base. Now, the extent of this devastation of the harrying of the North, the extent is so strong that 20 years later, William had a census produced, something you may have heard of before called the Doomsday Book, something you'll learn a little bit more about in a couple of weeks. But the Doomsday Book was essentially a document that William had produced, saying how much money people had, where people lived, how many people lived in an area, and who owned what land. It was basically a big document he had produced, collecting lots of information about his country. And this Doomsday Book, when it was produced 20 years after the harrying of the North, said that 60% of Yorkshire was waste. That 60% of Yorkshire was not being used for any farming or didn't have anybody living on it. Essentially, the consequences of the harrying of the North lasted over 20 years later in Yorkshire. Now, in terms of other consequences of the harrying of the North, another consequence is that William is finally giving up on the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. He's no longer trusting them, and he's no longer trying to get their loyalty. He's essentially removing them from positions of power. And after that second Anglo-Saxon rebellion, after the harrying, there's a huge upturn in the amount of Normans William is appointing to have roles like earls and barons, as we'll learn about in a couple of weeks. So he's removing Anglo-Saxons from positions of authority within the aristocracy. Another consequence is actually that harrying was really effective in doing what William wanted it to do. After the harrying of the North, there were no more rebellions in the north of England because the people weren't strong enough, they couldn't raise an army, they could barely even live in the north of England, never mind have the resources and energy to fight. It also really effectively stopped the Vikings from attacking in the north as well. And it's important to know that after the harrying of the North, the Vikings never landed in the north of England again under William's rule. Now, there was one rebellion after the harrying of the North, the rebellion at Ely, which you learned about last week. But it's important to note that Ely was in East Anglia. I'll put the spelling of that on the screen for you. Now, East Anglia was not part of the north of England. So the harrying was effective in stopping the Vikings from landing in the north as well. However, perhaps a more negative consequence for William is that after the harrying at the north, he was very strongly criticised by the Pope. Now, the Pope had been somebody who had supported William in the past. You might remember during the Battle of Hastings, the Pope actually gave William the papal banner to show that the Pope supported his claim to the English throne. Well, actually, after the harrying, the Pope started to criticise William for essentially killing 100,000 of his own people. This was seen as a very unchristian thing for him to do, obviously. And that damages William's credibility. As you can imagine as well, the harrying of the North also does damage to the wealth of England. The farmland, the towns, the burghs, the shires, many of them were destroyed. Which means the country that William is in charge of is now weaker than before the harrying. So yes, it might mean that he secured his position as king because there were no more revolts in the north. He is now in charge of a weaker country. So he's got more control, but the country is poorer because of his actions. Okay, brilliant. So there are all the consequences and the events of the harrying of the north. And to finish up this lesson, I'd like you to just develop and check in on your understanding of the events by answering questions 4, 5 and 6. Again, I'd like you to push to answer in full sentences and at least 3 sentences for each, including lots of subject knowledge and explanation. That word because is always a brilliant word to be using. Then when you've answered those 4 questions, that's the end of this lesson. Now the next lesson you've got this week doesn't have a video. All of it is about developing your memory for the events and the causes of the harrying of the Norse. So take a break for a day or 2, then come back to your next lesson and start to see how much of this one is stuck and how much of it you need to fill into gaps. In that lesson, there are then some resources to help you fill those gaps in. Well done for completing this lesson, and well done for completing nearly 6 weeks now of remote learning. I can tell you myself, I'm sick of this spare bedroom. I'm ready to get back in school. Hopefully we're back in school soon. But I know me, Mr. Durnford, Miss Forbes and Mr. Carter, we're all really impressed by how many of you are doing such a good job at keeping motivated and producing some really good work, even not in the classroom. We look forward to seeing you hitting hand in on Google Classroom so we can read through your work. As always, please remember, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me or your classroom teacher. Look after yourselves, and hopefully I'll see you soon.